So how can changing tax rates lead to some type of economic growth through supply-side fiscal policies? We can take a look at the Laffer curve to illustrate this properly. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Laffer curve itself and see what it's going to tell us intuitively. So what is the Laffer curve? The Laffer curve, let me write this out, Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is just going to show us a hypothetical relationship between tax rates and tax revenues. So the Laffer curve shows the hypothetical relationship between tax rates and tax revenues. Between tax rates and tax revenues. So what type of relationship do you think, or what type of slope do you think our line is going to have under the Laffer curve? Well, it's going to take a few different shapes depending on what the tax rate is going to be. So let's build this up with a little bit of economic intuition. So suppose that we take two extremes right here. So extreme number one, if tax rates are 0%, what do you think tax revenues are going to equal? If tax rates are 0%, that means the government is not taxing you on any of the work that you have done. So if they are not taxing you on any of the work that you have done, that inherently says that tax revenue should equal to 0 as well. So tax revenues will equal to 0. So essentially, tax rates are equal to 0. The government's not collecting any taxes at all. So therefore, their tax revenues are going to equal to 0 as well. The other end of the extreme is 100%. So if tax rates are 100%, what do you think tax revenues are going to be? In this instance, tax revenues are also going to equal to 0. Tax revenues will also equal to 0. And why do you think this is going to be the case? In this instance, are you incentivized to work at all under these conditions? No matter what work you do, no matter how big or how small it may be, it's going to be taken all by the government. So you earn $1 in income, the government takes 100% of that. You earn $10 million in income, the government takes 100% of that. So under these circumstances, under this scenario, no one is incentivized to work at all, so tax revenues are also equal to 0. And based on these two extremes, it tells us exactly what the Laffer curve is going to look like. So if tax rates are relatively low, if they go from 0% to say maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% and all the way up, then that's just going to say that, hey, there are some people that are going to work and tax revenue should also be higher. However, as tax rates keep on getting higher and higher, there's going to be some point where tax revenues are going to equal to 0 and they're going to be lower in this instance because people are no longer incentivized to work at all. So based on this idea, based on these two extreme points, the Laffer curve is going to go ahead and take a look like a parabola. We have the average tax rate on the vertical axis, which goes in between 0 and 100%, and the tax revenue, which goes on the horizontal axis. It tells us exactly how much revenues the government is collecting in taxes. And with all of this, we notice that there's going to be some points where we have very high tax revenues, and then there's going to be some tax rates that give us very low tax revenues. So suppose that we compare point A and point B against one another. Point A has a very high tax rate and it generates some type of tax revenues. And with a very high tax rate, there's not a lot of people that are working, but there are still a few people working. And based on the few people that are working, because it's such a high tax rate, the government collects some amount of taxes. Let's call this maybe $1 trillion in tax revenue. However, if we go to something like point B has a very relatively low tax rate, and because it's a relatively low tax rate, there's a lot of people that are working, but because there's a lot of people working, it's also going to be generating some type of tax revenue, and it's going to be generating $1 trillion in tax revenue. So something like point A and point B, even though they have two different tax rates, we have a high tax rate and a low tax rate at point B, it tells us that, hey, it's going to generate the same amount of tax revenues. So in this instance, there's actually two different tax rates that can generate the same amount of tax revenues for the government. And as we notice, something like point C in this instance, this little hump of the parabola, this is exactly where the government is going to be generating the highest amount or the maximum amount of tax revenues. But do we know exactly what for sure the maximum tax, what the best or optimal tax rate is going to be based on the setup that we have right here? Can we say that it's 50%? Can we say it's 40%, 30%? Is it 80%? And the answer is we don't know what the optimal tax rate is. Based on the setup that we have right here, we can only say for sure it's going to be in between 0 and 100%. That's where the optimal tax rate is going to be. And point C is exactly where we're going to be generating that maximum amount of tax revenues. So if our current tax rate is somewhere like at point A, in order to generate the maximum amount of tax revenues, what should we do with the tax rate? We should go ahead and lower the tax rate in order to get something like point C. If we're currently operating at point B, what should we do instead? We should be raising the tax rate in order to generate the maximum amount of tax revenues. So in this instance, we want to be operating at point C because that's where the government's going to be generating the most amount of tax revenues, and that's where they can encourage a lot of investment by firms and corporations, and that will induce a lot of economic growth with the supply side fiscal policy. But essentially, we don't know exactly what the optimal tax rate is because once again, it's kind of difficult to change tax code and tax law within the United States, and there's not a lot of empirical research that tells us exactly what the optimal tax rate is for the country. So all we can really say for sure is if we're operating in the top half of the parabola, we should probably go ahead and lower tax rates. And if we're operating at the bottom half of the parabola, we should probably go ahead and increase tax rates in order to generate the maximum amount of tax revenues. We don't know for sure what the optimal tax rate is going to be. And that's essentially the inner underlines of what the Laffer curve is going to tell us. And Arthur Laffer was the one that actually came up with this Laffer curve, and he actually came up with it during lunch, and he wrote down this entire model on a napkin. He made it with lunch with Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, of all people. And the napkin that he wrote this model down is actually in a museum in Washington, D.C. So if you want to go ahead and see the napkin, you can go ahead, take a look at one of the museums, and you'll be able to see this entire model in its entirety. So Arthur Laffer at lunch with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. It's a really, really weird combination of people, but essentially this is what the Laffer curve is going to tell us. And basically combining everything that we've taken a look at with supply side fiscal policies, if the government is successful at targeting the long-run aggregate supply curve in order to induce these supply-side fiscal policies to induce economic growth, we're going to have a shift of the LRAS curve over to the right. So we were initially starting off at point A in equilibrium, but as we shift the LRAS curve over to the right with these supply-side fiscal policies, we end up at point B with a much higher potential GDP or full employment GDP with lower prices. So once again, we don't see this trade-off between the price level and GDP, which is why the government would like to sort of target this LRAS curve because of all the benefits it can be generating for the economy. But once again, we typically don't shift the LRAS curve all too often unless we are explicitly told to do so. We are going to be a little bit more concerned with the short-run fluctuations. So the vast majority of the time, whenever we talk about fiscal policy, whenever we introduce the shocks of changing government spending, changing taxes, or changing transfer payments, we typically are going to be affecting the aggregate demand curve instead. So here, once again, you just want to be a little bit more careful with whether or not we're targeting the aggregate demand curve or the long-run aggregate supply curve with supply-side fiscal policies, and we generally will be a little bit specific with all of this. With all of this in mind, we want to go ahead and turn our attention just a little bit more to the political side and see exactly how long it's going to be taking any one piece of fiscal policy legislation to actually have an impact on our own lives, and what type of inherent stability do we have within our own economy, just in case if policymakers or politicians can't come to some type of agreement, just to ensure that the economy can be moving along on a smooth path. So a little bit more of the political implications coming up next in the next sections.